On a winter evening in 2007, first responders walked into a Virginia home and found a woman dead in her living room. There was a gun nearby and a folded, typed note resting exactly where they were meant to see it. It read as a clear case of suicide. But what those responders were actually looking at has a specific name in homicide investigations. It is called crime scene staging. Somebody killed another person, and instead of running away, they stayed. They rearranged the furniture, they posed the body, and they wrote a script, hoping the police would believe the picture instead of the physical evidence. The killer is building a fiction based on how they imagine a suicide should look. The problem for them is that human imagination is neat and generalized. Real death, however, is deeply messy and entirely specific. And in this case, the death of Jocelyn Ernest, that specific, messy reality came down to a single wrong detail. Pressed into that typed suicide note was a fingerprint, and it did not belong to Jocelyn. When a room is deliberately dressed up to convince the authorities of a lie, one contradiction is all it takes. That one print broke the fiction and turned a tragedy of despair back into an active murder investigation. To find those contradictions, detectives often look away from the physical room and focus on the victim's life. Investigators call this victimology. It means learning who the person was and how they lived before deciding how they died. In a staged scene, the victim's established habits rarely match the killer's setup. A note might be typed out on a clean sheet of paper, but the victim's friends will tell police she never typed her private thoughts. She wrote everything by hand in looping ink her entire life. You start noticing environmental details that simply do not fit. A dog is left unfed, though neighbors swear they never missed. The house thermostat is cranked up, despite complaints about heating bills. There is no blood or fiber evidence in a high thermostat, but these behavioral cracks reveal the truth. A killer can easily control the furniture and the temperature, but they cannot flawlessly mimic the daily textures of the person they just killed. Behavioral clues alone rarely secure a conviction. The ultimate arbiter of truth in these cases is the forensic pathologist. You can completely rewrite the story of a living room, but the human body keeps its own unalterable record. Consider a gunshot wound. There is an entire science dedicated to telling a self-inflicted shot from one fired by another hand. Pathologists examine the trajectory to see if a person could physically reach that angle, and they look closely at the physics of a contact shot. A contact wound leaves a distinct signature: a burn halo, concentrated soot, and unburned powder driven deep into tissue. If a staged suicide claims the gun was held to the head, but was actually fired from a distance, these tight markers are completely missing. The same physical rules apply to a staged hanging. A genuine hanging causes death by slow suffocation, leaving a highly specific pattern on the neck. Manual strangulation, or a ligature applied by someone else's hands, crushes the tissue differently and leaves marks that almost never appear in a true suicide. If there are defensive cuts on the palms from throwing hands up against a blade, the body fought back. Regardless of how peacefully the corpse is arranged on the floor afterward, the physical injuries carry the real evidence of that struggle. Suicides aren't the only events killers fake. Burglaries are heavily staged too, and they often fail because the killer employs a false logic that ignores the practical, chaotic reality of an actual break-in. A killer might smash a window to suggest an intruder forced their way in, but if they break the pane from the inside out, the shards of glass end up scattered across the lawn or the snow outside, leaving clear forensic proof of a staged entry. Then there are the behavioral errors. A staged scene will often have dresser drawers pulled open in a tidy top-to-bottom sequence. A real thief rips open the bottom drawer first, so they don't have to close it to search the next one. Or high-value jewelry sits in plain sight, while the killer steals items no stranger would ever take. This is a bloodstain pattern analysis document. It shows how blood has its own grammar. The shape a droplet makes when it lands and how it travels through the air obeys strict physics. A pool of blood that should have sprayed, or a spatter pattern that contradicts the pose of the body, cannot be manually faked. Even if a stager scrubs the floor with bleach, invisible traces survive. Every drop and smear is a sentence written in the language of physics. The stagers do not speak it fluently, but the analysts do. When the FBI's behavioral analysts looked at hundreds of these crime scenes, a clear pattern emerged about who builds them. They are almost never strangers. The suspect is overwhelmingly someone with a prior relationship to the victim, usually a spouse or a family member. A stranger who breaks in can simply run away into the dark. An intimate partner cannot. They stay behind to author the ending, desperately trying to step out of the role of prime suspect and into the role of the grieving survivor, managing their own panic by organizing the room. Which brings us back to Jocelyn Ernest. Layer by layer, her staged suicide collapsed. The fingerprint on that typed note was identified as her estranged husband, Wesley. He built the fiction to end the investigation, and it became the exact piece of evidence that convicted him. The irony of a staged crime scene is that the disguise itself narrows the suspect pool. The deep psychological need to control the narrative is a behavioral signature of its own, pointing detectives straight towards someone the victim trusted. But there is an unsettling truth at the center of this subject. We only know about the failures, the cases with the wrong handwriting and the backwards glass. The successful stagings, by definition, were never caught. They are sitting in warehouse boxes right now, officially closed as tragic accidents or quiet suicides. Those successes often rely on a dangerous mistake within the investigation itself. Detectives call it threshold diagnosis. It happens when an investigator decides exactly what happened within the first few seconds of walking through the door, and then unconsciously bends every subsequent piece of evidence to fit that initial assumption. The note on the table says suicide, so the strange angle of the wound gets explained away. And the unfed dog gets completely forgotten. The killer is betting heavily on human tunnel vision, the simple fact that people tend to see exactly what they expect to see. Defeating that tunnel vision requires immense discipline. The best detectives have to walk into a room that looks completely obvious and refuse to be sure. They treat the room as a claim rather than a fact, until a loose thread finally appears. A staged scene is ultimately just a story told by someone who was not present for the real event, only for the version they wish had happened. And in the space between that imagined death and the real one, the physics always leave a mark.